The crews called it suicide range. Less than 30 yards between tanks where armor meant nothing, where a single second decided who lived and who burned alive inside a steel tomb, where the math became brutally simple and the odds became a prayer whispered into static-filled headsets, and no Sherman had ever outturned a Panther in close combat because the physics simply didn't allow it, because German engineering had created a predator that could smell American tanks from 1,000 yards and kill them from 800, because every tactical manual, every after-action report, every whispered conversation in frozen foxholes confirmed the same terrible truth. In a close-range duel, the Sherman dies first, always, without exception, without hope. But on a freezing morning outside Metz in late November 1944, when frost turned every surface into glass and fog rolled through the Lorraine countryside like something alive and malevolent, a 22-year-old farm kid from Nebraska named Daniel Hale accidentally slammed his Sherman tank into the wrong gear during a point-blank ambush and discovered a maneuver that no engineer at Detroit Arsenal, no tactician at Fort Knox, and no Allied tank commander in Europe had ever imagined possible. Move born from pure panic and mechanical intuition that didn't just save his crew. It rewrote how Shermans fought at knife-fight distance and gave American tankers a desperate trick that would save dozens of lives in the brutal close-quarters combat of the Siegfried Line, the Hurtgen Forest, and the streets of German cities where tigers and panthers lurked around every corner like steel demons waiting to pounce. The morning began the way most mornings began in that miserable winter campaign. Cold, wet, exhausting, with the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from sleeping in a metal box that alternated between freezing and cooking you alive, from eating cold rations that tasted like cardboard mixed with motor oil, from knowing that every sunrise might be your last because somewhere out there in the fog and the forests, German armor was hunting. The fog that morning settled on the mud like wet cement, thick and gray and impenetrable, reducing visibility to maybe 40 yards on a good sight line, maybe 20 in the wooded ravines where Bulldog 3, a tired M4A3 Sherman with a white star on its turret and 7 kill rings painted beneath the gun barrel, was currently grinding forward at 4 miles per hour with its crew buttoned up tight and every nerve screaming danger. Frost shimmered on the tank's hull in delicate patterns that would have been beautiful if anyone had time to appreciate beauty, if anyone had the mental space for anything except the gut-churning fear that came from knowing that German 75mm and 88mm guns could reach out and touch you before you even knew they were there, could turn your tank into a crematorium in the time it took to draw breath. The smell inside Bulldog 3 was familiar to every Sherman crew in Europe. A mixture of cordite residue from previous engagements, hot engine oil seeping up through the deck plates, unwashed bodies and damp wool, the metallic tang of fierce sweat, the ghost of cigarette smoke and the sulfurous stink of spent shell casings rolling around the turret basket, all of it combining into an odor that was somehow both revolting and comforting because it meant you were still alive, still breathing, still fighting. Artillery rumbled in the distance like thunder echoing under the earth. The deep bass notes of American 155mm guns pounding German positions miles away. The occasional sharp crack of German 88s responding, and every tanker knew that sound intimately, knew it in their bones, knew the difference between friendly and enemy artillery the way farmers knew rain from hail, and right now the friendly guns sounded too far away to matter, too far away to help if things went sideways. The dread had started spreading through the battalion the night before when rumor, that most reliable and most feared source of information in any army, confirmed that a Panther company had been spotted in the sector, and for Sherman crews that news landed like a death sentence because everyone knew the deadly math, everyone had heard the stories, everyone had seen the burned-out hulks of M4s that had made the mistake of engaging Panthers at anything less than perfect ambush range. The Panther was everything the Sherman wasn't. Sleek, deadly, almost invincible from the front, with armor so thick that the standard American 75mm gun might as well have been throwing rocks at a castle wall, with a high-velocity KWK-42 that could punch through Sherman armor at distances where the Sherman's gun was practically useless, with better optics that let German gunners see their targets sooner and clearer, with a lower silhouette that made it harder to spot and easier to conceal, with more stable suspension that kept the gun steady even while moving cross-country, with faster turret traverse under power that let it swing onto targets with predatory speed. The Sherman, by contrast, was tall as a barn, thin-skinned enough that German guns could penetrate from almost any angle, powered by a gasoline engine that had earned it the nickname Ronson, after the cigarette lighter because it lit up on the first strike, slow in cross-country turning because its gearbox wasn't built for sudden torque changes, and generally outmatched in every category that mattered when steel met steel at combat range. Long-range duels favored the Panther so completely it wasn't even a contest. German tankers could kill Shermans from 1,000 yards while American return fire bounced off like hail on a roof. Medium-range engagements still favored the Panther because even at 400 yards the Sherman needed a perfect side shot to penetrate while the German tank could kill from any angle. Close-range ambushes, the kind where American tank destroyers excelled, still tilted toward the Panther because its thicker armor and superior crew training meant it could usually survive the first hit and return fire with devastating effect. And at 30 yards, at that mythical, terrifying, almost never encountered range where tanks were practically touching, the Sherman was naked, defenseless, a metal coffin waiting for the German gunner to pull his trigger because at that range armor didn't matter because any gun could penetrate any tank, and the only thing that decided survival was who got their gun on target first, who had the faster turret traverse, who had the cooler nerves, who had the mechanical advantage, and in every single one of those categories the Panther won. On paper, in the field manuals printed at Aberdeen Proving Ground, in the tactical doctrine taught to tank commanders at Fort Knox, in the cold mathematics of armor thickness and gun penetration and turret rotation speed, a Sherman could not outturn a Panther at close range. It was physically impossible, mechanically impossible, tactically suicidal to even try. But paper didn't account for mistakes, didn't account for frozen mud and worn gearboxes and the chaotic improvisation that defined actual combat, didn't account for farm kids who understood machines in their bones rather than their brains, didn't account for what would happen on Hill 312 just after sunrise when 5 young Americans came face to face with a German predator and lived to tell about it. The crew of Bulldog 3 had been together since Normandy, had survived the hedgerow hell of Cobra, the race across France, the brutal fighting around Nancy, and now this miserable slog toward the German border through mud and rain and the kind of cold that made metal burn your skin on contact. In the driver's compartment, wedged into the left front corner of the tank with the transmission housing hot against his right leg and the steering levers within easy reach of his calloused hands, sat PFC Danny Hale, 22 years old, 6 feet of wire and bone wrapped in a tanker's coveralls that had gone from olive drab to something approaching black with accumulated grease and dirt. Danny was a farm kid from outside McCook, Nebraska, where his family ran 200 acres of wheat and corn and kept a dozen pieces of temperamental machinery running through Depression-era poverty and Dust Bowl desperation, where he'd learned to diagnose engine problems by sound and fixed transmissions with baling wire and prayer, where he'd spent more time under tractors than in school and had developed an almost supernatural feel for how machines wanted to move, how gears meshed, how power flowed through metal and oil to become motion. He was nervous, always nervous, truth be told, because he had enough imagination to understand how many ways a tanker could die and enough mechanical knowledge to know exactly how thin the armor was between him and German steel. But he was also the best driver in the company, able to thread the 30-ton Sherman through terrain that should have been impassable, able to coax performance from the transmission that the manual said was impossible, able to feel through the steering levers what the tracks were doing in mud or snow or the broken rubble of French villages. Up in the turret, standing in the commander's position with his head and shoulders in the cupola where he could theoretically see the battlefield if the fog ever lifted, Lieutenant Jack Monroe scanned the gray nothing with binoculars that showed him exactly nothing useful. His jaw tight with the kind of controlled tension that came from 6 months of combat and the knowledge that relaxing for even a moment could get everyone killed. Monroe was 31, ancient by tanker standards, a veteran of the North Africa campaign who'd fought at Kasserine Pass and learned the hard way what German armor could do to American tanks. A steady hand who believed in discipline and doctrine and doing things by the book because improvisation was how people died, except he also believed in his crew and trusted them in ways that sometimes surprised even him. He was the father figure, the calm voice on the intercom, the man who made decisions while shells were screaming in and kept his tone level even when terror was clawing at his chest, and right now his instincts were screaming danger even though he couldn't see a damn thing through the fog. In the gunner's seat to the left of the main gun, Corporal Leo Rosen pressed his face against the rubber padding of the periscope sight and tried to find anything to aim at in the gray soup beyond the tank, his hands resting lightly on the traverse and elevation controls with the kind of ready tension that spoke to hundreds of hours of practice and dozens of actual engagements. Rosen was third-generation American, his grandparents having fled pogroms in Poland at the turn of the century, and he'd grown up in Philadelphia shooting rats in his father's warehouse with a .22 rifle, developing the kind of natural marksmanship that couldn't be taught, the ability to put rounds exactly where he wanted them even under pressure. He was intense, sarcastic, the guy who dealt with fear by making dark jokes that made everyone uncomfortable, and he was absolutely lethal behind the gun, credited with 5 of the tank's 7 kills including a long-range shot on a Panzer for that the battalion commander still talked about. To his right, crammed into the loader's position where he spent his days manhandling 40-pound shells in a space barely big enough for a child, Frankie Morales from Brooklyn kept up a running stream of nervous chatter about baseball and women and the package his mother had sent that never arrived. Anything to fill the silence. Anything to keep from thinking too hard about the fact that he was sitting next to 60 rounds of high-explosive ammunition that would cook off like a bomb if the tank got penetrated. Frankie was the comic relief, the guy who could find something funny in even the worst situations, whose jokes were terrible but somehow necessary, whose laugh was too loud and too frequent but reminded everyone that they were still human, still alive, still capable of feeling something other than fear. And down in the bow gunner position in the right front corner, manning the .30 caliber machine gun that was useful against infantry but absolutely worthless against armor, Tommy Field gripped his gun with white knuckles and tried not to think about how thin the armor was around his position, how easy it would be for a Panzerfaust or a 75mm shell to come through the front plate and turn him into red mist. Tommy was 18, looked 16, had lied about his age to enlist after Pearl Harbor and now desperately wished he'd stayed on his parents' dairy farm in Wisconsin. But he was loyal, dependable, the little brother everyone tried to protect even though they all knew that in a tank there was no such thing as protection, only degrees of vulnerability. They'd started the morning the way they started every morning that they weren't actively being shot at, brewing coffee on the tank's engine grill while the motor was warming up, the can of grounds and the precious condensed milk heating in mess tins balanced carefully on hot metal, the ritual as important as the caffeine because it was normal, civilian, a thin thread connecting them to a world where people didn't die in burning metal boxes. They'd argued about baseball. Morales insisting the Dodgers would win it all next year, Rosen calling him delusional, and Monroe had read a letter from his wife for the third time that week, his finger tracing her handwriting like a prayer, while Hale had written a few lines home describing absolutely nothing about the war and everything about how much he missed seeing the horizon stretch forever across Nebraska plains. Tommy had tried to join the conversation but mostly just listened, the kid always listening, always watching, always scared but trying not to show it, and they'd all fallen silent when the distant crump of German 75mm fire echoed from somewhere north, that sound that made every tanker's stomach clench because it meant somebody was fighting, somebody was dying, and it could easily be them next. The jokes had died then, the way jokes always died when combat got close, and they'd buttoned up the tank and started rolling with B Company toward their assigned position, covering the left flank of the battalion's advance toward a nameless hill that intelligence said was lightly defended but that every veteran knew would be hell because intelligence was always wrong, because the Germans always had more than expected, because easy missions didn't exist in this war. Hill 312 was nothing special, just a low rise covered in skeletal trees and broken by a few stone walls that French farmers had built a century ago. But it offered observation over the approach to Metz, and that made it valuable, made it something worth fighting for, made it the kind of place where Americans and Germans would kill each other over terrain. The controls, because there was nothing else to do, nowhere to go, no way to stop what he'd started. In the turret, Monroe was thrown against the cupola so hard he bit his tongue, tasting blood, watching through the vision blocks as the world spun faster than it should, faster than doctrine said was possible, the Panther sliding across his field of view like a target in a shooting gallery, except this target had a gun that could kill them all. Rosen lost his sight picture completely as the tank rotated, his eye coming off the periscope, his hands scrambling to traverse the turret fast enough to keep up with the hull rotation, and he was shouting, "What the fuck?" into the intercom even as his gunner instincts were trying to reacquire the target, trying to get the reticle back on German steel. Morales went to his knees in the turret basket, catching himself on the breech, the shell he was holding clattering against metal, and he was praying in Spanish, rapid-fire Hail Marys mixing with curses, while Tommy was slammed into the bow gun mount hard enough to leave a bruise that would last a week if he lived that long. The physics of what was happening were complex but the result was simple. The Sherman was performing a turn faster than its specifications allowed, faster than any Allied tanker in Europe had ever seen an M4 turn, the combination of reverse high torque and asymmetric track grip and frozen mud creating a hyper-aggressive pivot that bordered on uncontrolled but was still barely controllable. The tank whipped around its locked right track like a compass needle finding north, completing 30 degrees of rotation in the first second, 45 degrees by second two, and the Panther crew, professional, experienced, expecting the Sherman to attempt a standard forward pivot that they could easily track, suddenly found their target doing something impossible, something that violated their understanding of how American tanks moved. The Panther gunner, Hauptfeldwebel Ernst Kohler, a veteran of the Eastern Front with 12 kills and a close combat clasp in silver, had his sight picture lined up perfectly at the Sherman's center mass, had his finger taking up trigger slack, had already composed the after-action report in his head about how they'd killed an M4 at 20 yards in heavy fog, but then the American tank did something that made him question his eyes. The Sherman wasn't pivoting normally, it was sliding, spinning, moving like no American tank should move, and Kohler's training told him to follow the movement, to traverse the turret to track the target. But the speed of the Sherman's rotation was exceeding his turret's ability to follow even under power, and for the first time in 3 years of combat Ernst Kohler felt something close to alarm because tanks didn't move like that. American tanks especially didn't move like that, and his firing solution was falling apart as the range shrank to 15 yards and the Sherman kept rotating. Inside Bulldog 3, Danny Hale was discovering something that no Detroit engineer had ever documented because no sane driver would attempt it. The reverse high gear, when combined with a lock track on frozen ground, created a pivot turn so aggressive that the Sherman effectively drifted like a car on ice, the rear of the tank sliding out and around while the front barely moved, the whole machine executing a rotation that was part controlled maneuver and part barely controlled disaster. His foot was buried in the throttle keeping the revs up because instinct told him that if he let the engine die now they'd be sitting ducks, and his hands were fighting the steering levers to keep some semblance of control while the world spun outside the narrow driver's viewport, but some distant part of his brain, the part that had grown up fixing tractors, that understood machines in his bones, was recognizing that this was working, that the impossible maneuver was actually working, that they were turning faster than the Panther could rotate its turret. 60 degrees of rotation, 70, 80, and Monroe was shouting, "Hold it, hold it, hold it!" Trying to give Rosen a stable firing platform, trying to time the moment when the Sherman's hull would stabilize enough for the gunner to take his shot. Watching through the cupola as the Panther's turret continued to traverse but was falling behind, losing the race, unable to bring its gun to bear before the Sherman completed its impossible turn. Rosen was traversing his turret like a madman, his right hand spinning the manual traverse wheel because the power traverse couldn't keep up with what the hull was doing. His eye pressed so hard against the sight that it would leave a ring on his face for hours, and he was tracking the Panther's hull as it slid across his field of view, waiting for the angle, waiting for Monroe's command, waiting for the moment when physics and geometry and desperation aligned into something that might be called a shot. 85 degrees, 90 degrees, and suddenly the Sherman stopped rotating as Hale found the correct pressure on the steering levers, as the tracks found grip, as the physics that had been working in their favor decided they'd had enough luck for one day, and the tank rocked to a halt with its side facing the Panther at 12 yards, close enough that Hale could have thrown a rock and hit the German tank, close enough that both crews could practically see each other's eyes, close enough that armor meant nothing and everything came down to who had their gun lined up first. Except the Sherman did have its gun lined up first, because Rosen had been tracking through the turn, because Monroe's timing had been perfect, because Danny Hale's accidental maneuver had bought them the 3 seconds they'd needed, and now Bulldog 3 had something no Sherman should ever have against a Panther. A side shot, a 90-degree angle, a chance. The Panther's flank armor was visible through Rosen's sight, the 40 millimeters of steel that protected the side hull, thick enough to stop most things at range but not thick enough at 12 yards. Not thick enough when a 75 millimeters gun with a tungsten core was pointing straight at it, and Rosen didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't wait for confirmation because this was the shot, the only shot they'd get, and he pulled the trigger. The 75 millimeters gun fired with a concussion that shook the entire tank, the breech slamming back in its race with industrial violence, the shell casing ejecting and clattering against Morales's leg, cordite smoke filling the turret in a gray cloud that made everyone's eyes water, and the armor-piercing round crossed the 12 yards between the two tanks in a time too short to measure, moving at 2,800 feet per second, carrying all the kinetic energy of a 30-pound projectile moving at ungodly speed, and it punched into the Panther's side hull with a flash of sparks and a sound like the world's largest bell being struck by a sledgehammer. The tungsten penetrator went through the 40 millimeters of side armor like it was paper, the metal superheating instantly, spraying molten fragments into the Panther's crew compartment, through the ammunition storage, past the loader and into the engine bay, and Kohler knew instantly that his tank was dead even before the fire started, even before the secondary detonations began, because you didn't survive a side penetration, not at this range, not with an AP round that had just cored through your tank like a knife through cheese. Raus! He was screaming, Raus! Alle raus! And the German crew was already moving, the loader throwing his hatch and climbing, the driver and bow gunner popping their hatches in front. But the flames were faster, were already licking up through the engine deck, were already finding the hydraulic fluid and the ammunition and all the flammable things that German designers had tried to protect but couldn't, not against this kind of hit. Morales had another shell in his hands before Rosen even asked for it, was ramming it into the breech with shaking arms, was stepping back and slapping Rosen's shoulder to signal loaded, And Rosen fired again because you always fired again, always made sure, always put another round into a target until it stopped being a threat. And the second shot hit the Panther's turret ring where the steel was thinner, where the explosion of hot gas and metal fragments would find the ammunition stored in. The sponsons would find the silk charges that would burn so hot and so fast that the turret would lift clear off the hull. The Panther's ammunition cooked off with a deep humph that they felt through the Sherman's hull, a pressure wave that made their ears pop, and then the entire German tank was burning, flames shooting 20 feet into the air, black smoke boiling up to mix with the gray fog, figures scrambling from hatches and dropping to the ground and running because everyone knew that a brewing tank could explode properly at any moment, could send the turret spinning through the air like a child's toy. There was a moment of absolute silence inside Bulldog 3 except for the ticking of hot metal and the rasp of 5 men breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how they were still alive when every law of armored warfare said they should be dead. The ping of cooling metal was the only sound, the Sherman's barrel still radiating heat, the empty shell casings rolling across the turret basket floor, the smell of cordite so thick it felt like drowning, and outside the German tank was dying, was burning itself out in a funeral pyre visible through the fog like a beacon announcing that the impossible had just happened on Hill 312. Monroe's hands were shaking on the cupola rim, the combat veteran who'd seen everything suddenly seeing something he'd never seen before. A Sherman that had outturned a Panther at point-blank range, had gotten the angle, had taken the shot, had won an engagement that should have been suicide. "Report!" he croaked into the intercom, his voice hoarse, and one by one his crew checked in. Rosen okay? Morales okay? Tommy okay? And finally Hale's Nebraska drawl, shakier than usual. "Driver's okay, sir, but I think I put it in the wrong gear." The silence that followed that statement was profound, the kind of silence that comes when reality shifts and nobody quite knows how to process it, when the universe reveals that rules that seemed absolute were actually just suggestions, when a mistake becomes a miracle. "The wrong gear," Monroe repeated slowly, and his mind was racing through what he'd felt, what the tank had done, the whipping turn that had defied everything he knew about Sherman handling characteristics. "What do you mean the wrong gear?" Hale's voice crackled through the intercom, confusion and awe mixing in equal parts. "Sir, you told me hard right, and I meant to drop into low gear for a pivot, but I grabbed reverse high instead, and the tank it just spun, sir, faster than it should, and I don't know if I can do it again, but it worked. It definitely worked." Rosen was staring at the burning Panther through his sight, watching German crewmen roll in the mud trying to extinguish flames on their uniforms, and he was doing calculations in his head. The time from Monroe's command to the shot had been maybe 8 seconds. 8 seconds to execute a pivot turn that should have taken 15. 8 seconds in which they'd done something that felt like magic but was really just physics behaving strangely under exactly the right circumstances. "Wrong gear," he muttered, and then he started laughing, that kind of hysterical combat laughter that comes when terror releases its grip, when you realize you're still alive against all odds, when the absurdity of warfare reveals itself in its full glory. "This farm boy saved our asses with the wrong fucking gear." Morales joined the laughter, then Tommy, then even Monroe was chuckling despite himself, despite the professional part of his brain that was trying to understand what had happened, that was already thinking about whether this could be repeated, whether they'd just discovered something important or whether they'd simply gotten lucky in ways that would never happen again. The platoon sergeant's voice crackled over the radio. "Bulldog 3, we saw smoke. Confirm your status." And Monroe keyed his mic, his voice still shaky. "Bulldog 3 is green, we're good. We got the Panther, Sergeant, we got him close, real close." There was a pause on the radio, then, "Distance?" And Monroe looked out at the burning hulk maybe 15 yards away. Did the math. 20 yards, maybe less, we outturned him and got a side shot. Another pause, longer this time, because everyone listening knew that was impossible, that Shermans didn't outturn Panthers at 20 yards, that there was no tactic, no technique, no field manual procedure that made that possible, and finally the sergeant's voice came back. "Say again, Bulldog 3, you outturned a Panther?" And Monroe found himself grinning despite everything, despite the terror still coursing through his veins, despite not fully understanding what his driver had just done. "Affirmative, Sergeant. We did something new." When the company loggered up an hour later in a clearing that offered good defensive positions and the fog had finally burned off to reveal a cold November sun, word of Bulldog 3's kill spread through the battalion faster than official reports ever moved, carried by the informal network of tankers who smoked together and shared rumors and traded impossible stories about combat that turned out to be true. Drivers clustered around Danny Hale asking him to explain exactly what he'd done, how he'd grabbed the wrong gear, what the tank had felt like during the turn, whether he thought he could do it again, and Hale tried to explain but found himself struggling because the truth was he wasn't entirely sure himself. It had been instinct and panic and the muscle memory of someone who'd been driving machines since he was 12 years old, understanding on a level below conscious thought that machines would do things the engineers never intended if you pushed them the right way under the right circumstances. Monroe spent 20 minutes with the company commander going over exactly what had happened, sketching diagrams in the dirt, trying to articulate the mechanics of a maneuver that shouldn't exist, and the captain listened with the expression of someone who knows they're hearing something important but can't quite believe it, someone who's trying to reconcile field reports with everything they learned at Fort Knox about tank capabilities and limitations. The burned-out Panther sat on Hill 312 like a monument to the impossible, German crew bodies already covered with shelter halves by Graves registration, the tank itself a twisted sculpture of what happens when steel meets steel at ranges where both combatants should die but only one does, and throughout the afternoon American tankers made excuses to drive past it, to see the penetration holes in the side armor, to measure with their eyes the distance between the kill site and the position where Bulldog 3 had stopped, trying to understand in visceral terms what their minds struggled to accept. That night, huddled in bedrolls under the Sherman's hull where the engine heat kept the worst of the cold at bay, the crew of Bulldog 3 finally had time to process what had happened, to let the adrenaline drain away and feel the bone-deep exhaustion that came after cheating death. Danny Hale couldn't stop staring at his hands, these ordinary hands that had somehow found the wrong gear at exactly the right moment, and he kept replaying the sequence in his mind. The panic, the grab for the gear lever, the feeling of the transmission doing something it wasn't supposed to do, the violence of the turn that had felt like the tank was tearing itself apart but somehow hadn't. He thought about the tractors back home, about the time he'd accidentally discovered that his father's ancient John Deere could pull tree stumps better if you engaged the power takeoff in a specific sequence that wasn't in any manual, about how machines had personalities and quirks and would do things for you if you understood them deeply enough, and he wondered if that was what had happened today, if he'd understood the Sherman well enough that even in pure panic his hands had found something that worked even though it shouldn't have. Rosen sat with his back against the track, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from Morales, and he was thinking about the shot, about how perfect it had been, how the sight picture had come together just as the hull stabilized, how he'd pulled the trigger without conscious thought because there was no time for thought at that range, only action and reaction and the training that made certain movements automatic. He'd killed tanks before, had that cold satisfaction that came from putting rounds exactly where they needed to go. But this one felt different because this one had been impossible, because they should have died before he ever got to take his shot, because Danny's mistake had given him the angle that no gunner should ever get against a Panther at point-blank range. "You know what's crazy?" he said into the darkness. And the others stirred because talking after combat was how you processed it, how you made sense of chaos, how you reminded yourself you were still human. What's crazy is that Krautgunner was good. You could tell by how smooth his turret moved, how fast he was getting on target. And he still lost because our driver grabbed the wrong fucking gear. Morales laughed, that slightly manic edge still in his voice. Back in Brooklyn we had a guy who won at craps for 3 hours straight because he was throwing the dice wrong, had this weird spin that nobody could figure out, and the pit boss let him keep playing because technically he wasn't cheating, he just had terrible form that somehow worked, and I keep thinking about that, about how sometimes doing it wrong is more right than doing it right. Monroe lay in his bedroll staring up at the Sherman's belly where rust and mud and oil had created abstract patterns, and his mind was working through the tactical implications, through whether what Danny had done could be taught or whether it was just a perfect accident that would never happen again, through what it meant for how they fought German armor if there was even a chance that a Sherman could win a close-range turning duel. Tommy Field was quiet, had been quiet since the fight, and finally he spoke in a voice that was almost a whisper. "I thought we were dead, I really did. I saw that Panther and I just knew. And then we weren't dead and I don't know how to feel about that, like we used up all our luck in one go and now there's none left." Monroe reached over and gripped the kid's shoulder. "That's not how luck works, Tommy, and anyway that wasn't luck. That was Danny doing something brilliant even if he didn't mean to. That was all of us doing our jobs when it counted. And we're alive because we're good at this, not because we're lucky." But privately Monroe wasn't entirely sure he believed that, wasn't sure that what had happened could be explained by skill or training or anything except the kind of random chance that defined combat, the chaos factor that no amount of planning could account for, and he made a mental note to write to his wife tomorrow, to tell her he loved her without explaining why, without describing the Panther or the impossible turn or the fact that he'd come within 2 seconds of never writing to her again. The next morning brought new orders. The battalion was pushing toward the next objective, a small town whose name none of them could pronounce, and Bulldog 3 was back in the line with B Company moving through terrain that was slightly more open than the forests of Hill 312. Rolling farmland broken by hedgerows and stone walls and the occasional burned-out farmhouse. But something had changed in how they operated, a subtle shift in confidence that came from knowing they'd survived the unsurvivable, from having proof that Panthers weren't invincible gods of the battlefield but just machines that could be killed if you did the impossible. Monroe found himself thinking tactically about close-range engagements in ways he never had before, about how frozen mud or wet grass or any surface that reduced traction on one track might create opportunities for the kind of violent pivot turn that Danny had accidentally executed, about whether skilled drivers could learn to induce that kind of maneuver deliberately rather than through panic and luck. During a halt, he gathered several drivers from other tanks in the company, including a crusty sergeant named McKellen who'd been driving Shermans since North Africa and knew the M4's quirks better than anyone, and they talked through what had happened, using sticks in the dirt to diagram the physics, discussing gear ratios and torque curves and traction coefficients with the kind of technical depth that would have bored infantrymen to tears but that tankers found fascinating because their lives depended on understanding these things. McKellen listened carefully, asked pointed questions about exactly which gear Hale had selected, about how the steering levers had felt, about whether the turn had been controllable or purely chaotic, and finally he nodded slowly. "I felt something like that before, back in Tunisia, different circumstances but same principle. You get asymmetric traction and high torque and the tank wants to snap around faster than the transmission is designed for. Usually you fight it because it feels dangerous, feels like you're breaking something, but maybe in the right situation you lean into it instead of fighting it, maybe you use that violence." Another driver, a kid from Texas named Reeves, asked the obvious question, "But how do you practice something like that without flipping your tank or stripping gears?" And there was the rub, the fundamental problem with trying to turn an accident into a tactic. The Sherman wasn't designed for this kind of abuse, and pushing the transmission that way could easily result in mechanical failure that would leave you stranded in enemy territory, which was often a death sentence. Hale spoke up, his voice tentative because he was just a PFC talking to sergeants and officers, but his mechanical knowledge giving him authority. "Back home, when we had to move heavy equipment through mud, you learn that machines can handle a lot more than the manual says if you do it quick. Like you can overload a tractor for 5 seconds without hurting it, but if you sustain that overload you'll break something, so maybe this turn only works in short bursts, only when you absolutely need it, and you can't practice it 100 times because you'll destroy the transmission, but maybe you can practice it once or twice so you know what it feels like." Monroe was nodding, his tactical mind already working through doctrine. "We call it an emergency maneuver, something you only use when you're already dead otherwise. When a Panther or Tiger has you lined up and the normal pivot turn isn't fast enough, you go for the hard rotation and accept the risk of breaking your tank because a broken tank beats a burning tank." The discussion continued through the 10-minute halt and then into the evening after they'd secured their objective for the day, and word spread through the battalion about what the crews were calling Hale's drift or sometimes the reverse pivot trick, and opinions split immediately into 3 camps: those who thought it was brilliant and wanted to try it, those who thought it was suicidal and would just get people killed when their transmissions failed at critical moments, and those who figured that anything that killed Panthers was worth exploring even if it was dangerous. Within a week, 3 other Shermans in the battalion had attempted variations of the maneuver in training, using empty fields behind the lines where mechanical failure wouldn't mean death, and the results were mixed but instructive. One driver, trying to replicate what Hale had done, stripped his transmission gears completely and left his tank deadline for 4 days waiting for parts, earning himself an ass-chewing from the motor sergeant and proving that the maneuver couldn't be done casually or without perfect conditions. Another driver managed a pivot turn that was faster than standard but nowhere near as dramatic as what Bulldog 3 had achieved, suggesting that the frozen mud and the specific gear selection and maybe even the wear pattern on Hale's particular transmission had all contributed to the original maneuver in ways that couldn't be easily replicated. But the third driver, a former stock car racer from North Carolina named Dalton who had an intuitive feel for how vehicles behaved at the edge of control, managed something close to the original, a violent snap turn that completed 90 degrees of rotation in about 6 seconds, faster than any normal Sherman pivot, fast enough that it might actually make a difference in a close-range engagement. Dalton's technique was slightly different from what Hale had accidentally discovered. Instead of reverse high, he used a rapid shift from forward low to reverse low while simultaneously locking one steering lever and throwing the other wide open, creating a sudden reversal of power that, on slick ground, produced a skidding pivot that was controllable if you had quick hands and good instincts. The battalion maintenance officer, a captain who'd been a mechanical engineer in civilian life, examined the transmissions of all 3 tanks afterward and wrote a report that was equal parts fascinated and horrified, noting that the maneuver worked by essentially shock-loading the drivetrain in ways that the designers had tried to prevent, that it would reduce transmission life significantly if used repeatedly, but that, under specific conditions, low traction surfaces, emergency situations, skilled drivers, it could provide a tactical advantage that might justify the mechanical risk. His report made its way up to division, where some staff officer read it and filed it away with a note that field expedient tactics merit further study, which was Army speak for interesting, but we're not going to officially endorse this. And that was probably the right call because the maneuver was too situational, too dependent on driver skill and ground conditions and mechanical luck to ever become standard doctrine. But it entered the informal knowledge base of veteran Sherman crews, became one of those tricks that got passed along through word of mouth and demonstration, part of the accumulated wisdom that separated green crews from experienced ones. By December, as the battalion fought through the increasingly desperate German defenses on the approaches to the Siegfried Line, Hale's accidental discovery had saved at least 3 other crews that anyone knew about, and probably more that went unreported because tankers were superstitious about claiming credit for survival when so many others didn't survive. A Sherman from a company used a version of the pivot to evade a Jagdpanzer ambush in a village street, the violent turn getting them behind a stone wall before the German tank destroyer could fire, buying enough time for the crew to bail out before the Jagdpanzer put a round through the wall and into their abandoned tank, and all 5 men walked away because their driver had heard about what Bulldog 3 did and tried it when death was certain. Another crew in C Company, trapped in a narrow forest trail with a Panther approaching from ahead and no room to turn normally, used the technique to essentially spin their tank 180 degrees and retreat backward at speed, the driver keeping them in reverse high for a terrifying 30 seconds while the gunner fired smoke and the Panther's rounds cracked past in the fog, and they made it out because physics and desperation and a half-remembered story about a Nebraska farm kid had given them an option that shouldn't exist. And Bulldog 3 themselves used it twice more before the year ended. Once in a city street in Saarbrücken when a Panzer IV appeared at an intersection and Danny threw the Sherman into that violent pivot turn without even thinking, pure muscle memory from the first time, and they got the side shot and added another kill ring to their barrel. And once in open ground when a Panther caught them in a bad position and the snap turn didn't quite work, didn't give them the angle they needed, but did throw off the German gunner enough that his first shot missed and his second shot only tracked them instead of penetrating, and they managed to disengage behind a hill before the third shot came. That second time the transmission made a grinding sound afterward that had the motor sergeant shaking his head and muttering about how these crews were going to put him in an early grave. But he fixed it because that was his job and because even he had to admit that a transmission you could repair was better than a crew you could only bury, and he added his own note to the informal knowledge base. The hard pivot only works twice, maybe 3 times before you need a full transmission overhaul. So use it when you need it, but know you're borrowing from future mechanical reliability, taking capability from tomorrow to survive today. The crew of Bulldog 3 went through the rest of the winter campaign with a reputation that preceded them, known throughout the battalion and eventually the regiment as the tank that had outturned a Panther, that had done the impossible, and with that reputation came both respect and a certain amount of unwanted attention because suddenly they were the crew that everyone expected to pull off miracles, to survive situations that would kill others, to be somehow charmed or blessed or just luckier than they had any right to be. Monroe felt the weight of that expectation. The way other crews looked at them like they had some secret knowledge, some special skill that could be learned and passed on, and he tried to explain that it had been 90% accident and 10% skill, that they'd just been in the right place with the right mistake at the right time, but nobody wanted to hear that because everyone needed to believe that survival in a Sherman was something you could control, something you could learn, rather than just random chance in a metal box. Designed by the lowest bidder. Hale got a field commendation from the regimental commander, a ceremony that made him profoundly uncomfortable because he still couldn't fully articulate what he'd done or how he'd done it. And when the colonel pinned the medal on his coveralls and asked if he had anything to say, Hale just muttered, "I made a mistake that saved us, sir, and I guess sometimes mistakes are the right thing," which wasn't exactly inspiring rhetoric but which captured something true about combat, about how the chaos of the battlefield sometimes rewarded improvisation over planning, panic over procedure, the accidental genius of a farm kid over the calculated design of engineers. That night he wrote home to his parents, A letter that took him 3 hours to compose because he wanted to explain what had happened without making them worry more than they already did, without describing the Panther's gun barrel pointed at his face or the certainty of death or the flames consuming German crewmen, and what he finally wrote was, "I did something with the tank that I learned from fixing tractors with you, Dad, about how machines will do things the manual says they won't if you understand them deeply enough and need them badly enough, and it worked out okay. And I think maybe all those hours we spent in the barn fixing equipment that should have been replaced years ago taught me something that matters out here, something about not giving up on machines even when they're not doing what they're supposed to do." His father would read that letter in the cold Nebraska winter, standing in that same barn surrounded by the same temperamental equipment, and would understand exactly what his son meant, would feel a pride that had nothing to do with medals or commendations and everything to do with knowing that the skills he'd passed down, the mechanical intuition that had kept a struggling farm running through depression and drought, had saved his boy's life on a battlefield 5,000 miles away. Rosen dealt with the aftermath differently, with his characteristic sarcastic intensity that masked deeper feelings, and he started telling the story of Hill 312 to anyone who would listen, but he told it carefully, precisely, with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive because he was determined that the story would be told right, that future tankers would understand exactly what had happened and why it mattered. He'd seen too many war stories get mangled in the retelling, transformed into myths that bore no resemblance to reality, and he was determined that this one would stay true, so he made notes in a pocket notebook, writing down everything he could remember, the fog density, the range, the exact sequence of events, the sound the transmission made, the way the Panther's turret moved, even the smell inside the tank at the moment Monroe gave the order. His crewmates teased him about it, called him the historian. But Rosen ignored them because he knew something they didn't fully appreciate yet. That war stories were how knowledge survived, how tactics evolved, how the accumulated wisdom of the dead got passed to the living, and if he could tell this story well enough, accurately enough, maybe it would save someone else's crew someday. He was also dealing with his own survivor's guilt, the nagging question that hit him every night when he closed his eyes. Why had they lived when so many others died? What made them special? What made them deserve survival when better crews, braver crews, more experienced crews had burned in their Shermans? The standard answer, the one everyone gave, was that they'd been good and lucky in equal measure, but that didn't satisfy because luck felt too random, too arbitrary, and Rosen needed to believe that skill mattered, that training mattered, that the hours he'd spent practicing on the firing range and studying German tank silhouettes and rehearsing the manual for the 75mm gun had contributed to their survival in some quantifiable way. So he focused on the shot, on the fact that when Danny's maneuver had given him the angle, he'd made the shot count, had put the round exactly where it needed to go without hesitation or adjustment, and he told himself that this was the skill part, that the training had paid off when it mattered, and that helped him sleep a little better even as the guilt lingered. Morales found religion again after Hill 312, not in any dramatic conversion way but in a quiet return to the Catholic faith his mother had tried to instill in him growing up, and he started going to services whenever the battalion chaplain held them, started saying the rosary at night in his bedroll, started crossing himself before combat in a way he hadn't done since basic training. His crewmates didn't comment on it because everyone had their own way of dealing with the stress, their own rituals and superstitions that helped them function in a world where death was random and constant, and if Morales needed to believe that God or the Virgin Mary or some divine intervention had saved them on that foggy morning, who were they to argue? But it was more complicated than simple faith for Morales. He was grappling with the mathematics of survival, with the fact that they'd lived when 5 German tankers had died, and he couldn't quite shake the feeling that their survival had been purchased with enemy deaths in some kind of cosmic transaction that he didn't fully understand. The Panther crew had probably been someone's sons, someone's husbands or brothers, men who'd had breakfast that morning and made plans for leave and carried photos in their wallets just like American crews did, and they died burning because Danny Hale had grabbed the wrong gear and Leo Rosen had made a perfect shot, and the whole sequence of improbable events had aligned in a way that favored Americans over Germans for reasons that had nothing to do with justice or righteousness or any of the things chaplains talked about when they discussed why God allowed war. So Morales prayed not just for his crew's continued survival but for the German dead too, for their souls and for their families, and he didn't talk about this with anyone because he knew it would sound wrong, would sound like weakness or divided loyalty, but it helped him carry the weight of killing, helped him function in a world where survival required becoming efficient at ending other lives. Tommy Field, the youngest, the one who'd thought they were dead in those terrible seconds before the turn, dealt with it by becoming quieter, more watchful, Less the naive kid and more something harder that his crewmates recognized with a mixture of relief and sadness because every veteran crew went through this. Watched the innocence burn away in the forge of combat until what remained was functional but different. He stopped writing letters home as frequently, not because he didn't love his parents but because the gap between his experience and their ability to understand it had grown too wide, and he didn't know how to describe what it felt like to be certain you were about to die, to feel that absolute existential terror followed by the whiplash of survival, without either making them sick with worry or sounding like he was bragging about combat in a way that would dishonor the guys who didn't make it. Instead he started writing in a journal, short entries that he never planned to show anyone, just trying to capture moments and feelings before they faded. Before the war ended and he went home and tried to be normal again. And years later his daughter would find that journal in a box in the attic and read her father's 19-year-old handwriting describing the Panther at 20 yards and think about how close she'd come to never existing, how her entire life and her children's lives depended on a split-second mistake by a Nebraska farm kid in the winter of 1944. But that was decades in the future, unknowable and unimaginable, and in December 1944 Tommy just tried to do his job, to load the bow gun and scan for infantry and not think too hard about the fact that the armor around his position was barely thick enough to stop small arms fire, and at night he'd lie awake listening to the others breathe in their sleep and feel grateful in a way that had no words, just a deep bone-level awareness that he was alive and that was enough. The war ground on through December into January, the weather getting worse, the German resistance getting more desperate and more costly, and the battalion took casualties in the kind of grinding attrition that characterized this phase of the campaign. A tank here, a crew there, losses that accumulated until rosters looked nothing like they had in November, until veterans became rare and replacements became the majority. Green crews learning on the job because there was no other way to learn. Bulldog 3 survived through a combination of skill, caution, and continued luck, adding more kill rings to their barrel, taking hits that penetrated but didn't kill, losing and gaining crewmen as Tommy eventually got wounded by artillery fragmentation and was replaced by a kid from Idaho, as Morales took shrapnel in the arm and spent 2 weeks in a field hospital before rejoining the crew, as the Sherman itself was damaged badly enough twice that it had to be evacuated for depot level maintenance, and they drew different tanks that handled differently, felt different, didn't have the worn gearbox that had enabled the original maneuver. Monroe got promoted to captain and took over the company, leaving Bulldog 3 with a new commander, a green lieutenant fresh from Fort Knox who listened wide-eyed to the story of Hill 312 and tried too hard to replicate the success, pushing for aggressive tactics that Monroe gently but firmly shut down because he knew that the hard pivot maneuver wasn't a tactic you could base a fighting doctrine on, was just one tool in the box, useful in specific circumstances but not a magic solution. Hale stayed on as driver through all of this, becoming a sergeant by March, teaching new drivers what he'd learned but always emphasizing the limitations, the danger, the fact that the maneuver had worked once perfectly and a few times adequately but had also gotten crews killed when they tried it in the wrong conditions or without the skill to control what happened next, and he carried a quiet guilt about that, about the fact that his accidental discovery had become part of the collective knowledge base and had therefore gotten some crews in trouble when they attempted something beyond their capability. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Bulldog 3 and its crew had become part of battalion legend, the story of Hill 312 told and retold until it had achieved a mythic quality that made Monroe uncomfortable because myths weren't useful, weren't tactical, didn't help you survive the next engagement. But myths were necessary too, he'd come to realize, because armies ran on more than just logistics and tactics. They ran on morale, on the belief that victory was possible, on stories that proved American ingenuity could overcome German engineering. And if the story of a Nebraska farm kid accidentally discovering a maneuver that let a Sherman kill a Panther at point-blank range helped other crews believe they could survive, helped them go into combat with a little more confidence, then maybe the myth served a purpose even if the reality was more complicated. The crew scattered after VE Day, sent to different assignments as the Army began the massive reorganization that would eventually send some units to the Pacific and return others stateside, and they promised to stay in touch the way all combat crews promise, meaning it sincerely even though they knew that civilian life would pull them in different directions, that the intensity of what they'd shared couldn't be maintained in a world without war. Hale went home to Nebraska, took over the family farm when his father's health failed, married a local girl who'd waited for him, and spent the next 40 years fixing tractors and combining wheat and telling the occasional story about the war when someone asked, though he usually left out the details about the Panther and the fog and the certainty of death, preferring to let people think his service had been routine, boring, unmemorable. But in his workshop, mounted on the wall where he could see it while he worked, He kept a photograph of Bulldog 3 with its crew standing in front after the Panther kill. 5 young men grinning at the camera with the kind of relief that comes from surviving what shouldn't be survivable, and sometimes when he was working on a particularly stubborn piece of equipment, he'd glance at that photo and remember that machines would do things the manual said they wouldn't if you understood them deeply enough and needed them badly enough, a lesson learned in fog and terror that served him well in both war and peace. Rosen went back to Philadelphia, used the GI Bill to go to college, became a teacher and eventually a principal, and he never stopped telling the story of Hill 312, making it part of his history classes when they covered World War II, using it to illustrate how combat worked in reality versus how it looked in movies, how survival often depended on accidents and improvisation rather than planning and heroism, and his students always loved the story because it was real and human and contained actual tactical details rather than sanitized patriotic myth. Monroe stayed in the Army, made colonel by Korea, and every time he taught tank tactics to young officers he'd include a section on battlefield adaptation, on the importance of allowing crews to experiment and improvise within reasonable safety boundaries, on how rigid doctrine could get you killed when conditions didn't match the manual, and he'd usually tell the story of Bulldog 3 without mentioning that he'd been there, letting students think it was just another historical example rather than something he'd lived through, because the lesson mattered more than his personal connection to it. About to die, to feel that absolute existential terror followed by the whiplash of survival, without either making them sick with worry or sounding like he was bragging about combat in a way that would dishonor the guys who didn't make it. Instead he started writing in a journal, short entries that he never planned to show anyone, just trying to capture moments and feelings before they faded. Before the war ended and he went home and tried to be normal again. And years later his daughter would find that journal in a box in the attic and read her father's 19-year-old handwriting describing the Panther at 20 yards and think about how close she'd come to never existing, how her entire life and her children's lives depended on a split-second mistake by a Nebraska farm kid in the winter of 1944. But that was decades in the future, unknowable and unimaginable, and in December 1944 Tommy just tried to do his job, to load the bow gun and scan for infantry and not think too hard about the fact that the armor around his position was barely thick enough to stop small arms fire, and at night he'd lie awake listening to the others breathe in their sleep and feel grateful in a way that had no words, just a deep bone-level awareness that he was alive and that was enough. The war ground on through December into January, the weather getting worse, the German resistance getting more desperate and more costly, and the battalion took casualties in the kind of grinding attrition that characterized this phase of the campaign. A tank here, a crew there, losses that accumulated until rosters looked nothing like they had in November, until veterans became rare and replacements became the majority. Green crews learning on the job because there was no other way to learn. Bulldog 3 survived through a combination of skill, caution, and continued luck, adding more kill rings to their barrel, taking hits that penetrated but didn't kill, losing and gaining crewmen as Tommy eventually got wounded by artillery fragmentation and was replaced by a kid from Idaho, as Morales took shrapnel in the arm and spent 2 weeks in a field hospital before rejoining the crew, as the Sherman itself was damaged badly enough twice that it had to be evacuated for depot level maintenance, and they drew different tanks that handled differently, felt different, didn't have the worn gearbox that had enabled the original maneuver. Monroe got promoted to captain and took over the company, leaving Bulldog 3 with a new commander, a green lieutenant fresh from Fort Knox who listened wide-eyed to the story of Hill 312 and tried too hard to replicate the success, pushing for aggressive tactics that Monroe gently but firmly shut down because he knew that the hard pivot maneuver wasn't a tactic you could base a fighting doctrine on, was just one tool in the box, useful in specific circumstances but not a magic solution. Hale stayed on as driver through all of this, becoming a sergeant by March, teaching new drivers what he'd learned but always emphasizing the limitations, the danger, the fact that the maneuver had worked once perfectly and a few times adequately but had also gotten crews killed when they tried it in the wrong conditions or without the skill to control what happened next, and he carried a quiet guilt about that, about the fact that his accidental discovery had become part of the collective knowledge base and had therefore gotten some crews in trouble when they attempted something beyond their capability. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Bulldog 3 and its crew had become part of battalion legend, the story of Hill 312 told and retold until it had achieved a mythic quality that made Monroe uncomfortable because myths weren't useful, weren't tactical, didn't help you survive the next engagement. But myths were necessary too, he'd come to realize, because armies ran on more than just logistics and tactics. They ran on morale, on the belief that victory was possible, on stories that proved American ingenuity could overcome German engineering, And if the story of a Nebraska farm kid accidentally discovering a maneuver that let a Sherman kill a Panther at point-blank range helped other crews believe they could survive, helped them go into combat with a little more confidence, then maybe the myth served a purpose even if the reality was more complicated. The crew scattered after VE Day, sent to different assignments as the Army began the massive reorganization that would eventually send some units to the Pacific and return others stateside, and they promised to stay in touch the way all combat crews promise, meaning it sincerely even though they knew that civilian life would pull them in different directions, that the intensity of what they'd shared couldn't be maintained in a world without war. Hale went home to Nebraska, took over the family farm when his father's health failed, married a local girl who'd waited for him, and spent the next 40 years fixing tractors and combining wheat and telling the occasional story about the war when someone asked, though he usually left out the details about the Panther and the fog and the certainty of death, preferring to let people think his service had been routine, boring, unmemorable. But in his workshop, mounted on the wall where he could see it while he worked, he kept a photograph of Bulldog 3 with its crew standing in front after the Panther kill, 5 young men grinning at the camera with the kind of relief that comes from surviving what shouldn't be survivable, and sometimes when he was working on a particularly stubborn piece of equipment, he'd glance at that photo and remember that machines would do things the manual said they wouldn't if you understood them deeply enough and needed them badly enough, a lesson learned in fog and terror that served him well in both war and peace. Rosen went back to Philadelphia, used the GI Bill to go to college, became a teacher and eventually a principal, and he never stopped telling the story of Hill 312, making it part of his history classes when they covered World War II, using it to illustrate how combat worked in reality versus how it looked in movies, how survival often depended on accidents and improvisation rather than planning and heroism, and his students always loved the story because it was real and human and contained actual tactical details rather than sanitized patriotic myth. Monroe stayed in the Army, made colonel by Korea, and every time he taught tank tactics to young officers he'd include a section on battlefield adaptation, on the importance of allowing crews to experiment and improvise within reasonable safety boundaries, on how rigid doctrine could get you killed when conditions didn't match the manual, and he'd usually tell the story of Bulldog 3 without mentioning that he'd been there, letting students think it was just another historical example rather than something he'd lived through, because the lesson mattered more than his personal connection to it. And the maneuver itself, that accidental discovery born from panic and frozen mud and a Nebraska farm kid's mechanical intuition, faded from official doctrine but survived in the informal knowledge base of tankers, passed down through generations not as a standard tactic but as an emergency option, a last-ditch maneuver for when you're already dead and have nothing to lose, and even in later decades when Shermans were long retired and replaced by Pattons and then Abrams, the principle remained that machines could be pushed beyond their design specifications if you understood them deeply enough and were willing to accept the risk, that the chaos of combat sometimes rewarded improvisation over procedure, that the difference between life and death could come down to a split-second decision to do the wrong thing that turned out to be exactly right. The Panther remained one of Germany's most effective tanks throughout the war, feared and respected by every Allied tanker who faced it, superior in almost every measurable category to the Sherman. But on Hill 312 on a foggy morning in November 1944, the matchup that should have been suicide became instead a lesson in how warfare actually works, not according to engineering specifications or tactical doctrine, but according to the messy reality of human improvisation and mechanical chaos and the kind of desperate creativity that emerges when death is certain unless you do something, anything, that changes the equation. It was a wrong gear in the wrong moment that became the right maneuver, 5 seconds of violence that let a steel underdog outdance a giant, an accident that saved a crew and became a story and eventually a legend, proof that war is built on plans but won by the things no one planned, by the farm kids who know machines, by the gunners who make impossible shots, by the commanders who trust their crews, by the human element that no amount of engineering or tactical planning can fully account for, by the truth that sometimes the only way to survive is to break the rules, grab the wrong gear, and hope that physics decides to work in your favor just this once.